Benefits from two primary directions. One is the workability and the water retentivity, which makes it useful for the mason. They can do good work with it easily, and it makes good bond because it is workable and water retentive, unlike materials that are not water retentive. The other reason is then they're capillary active, so moisture that gets into them, which is not as much as people think, except on the tops, obviously, where they're getting wet all of the time with no protection. That capillarity means that the moisture that gets in moves, or the moisture that comes up inside moves out very quickly, which makes them less frost vulnerable because it's gone almost as soon as it's received, but also it keeps the building fabric dry routinely. That's what it does. So those are the two. There's a benefit to the craftsmanship and the quality of the work and the durability of the bond that you make, because you make a good one, and the key common denominator in both of those is lots of pure lime in the mix, as much as possible according to the purpose. And so you see here we've got not quite a pure lime, but nor a very hydraulic lime that we're using for the general face work. That's the most breathable. On the tops, where it does get very wet, we're displacing some, at least, of the concrete cement that they put on there, but actually that's a place where concrete might be your go-to, because you don't want it to be porous in the same way, because it's receiving a lot of water and it just needs to shed that water. If it's soaked in too much water, being too porous, obviously it would be vulnerable to frost damage. So you change the mix. So on the top, you can see, if you look carefully, at the moment the top mortars are looking very red, and that's because we've put a pozzolanic brick aggregate in there, brick dust I should say, to react with the lime and to create a hydraulic lime. But a hydraulic lime that I would argue is very different in its nature and character than a natural hydraulic lime. And again, you can make very pozzolanic, very hydraulic mortars by the hot mix method with free lime, with a lot of quick lime, and they retain that workability and that water retentivity in the earlier period of their set. Therefore they too make a very good bond because of that water retentivity. So you're using the lime, and you could say the extra lime is helping to make a very good bond, and then over a longer period of time than usually with natural hydraulic limes, that then becomes harder and tougher and more weather resistant. So we've got two different mixes on the same structure, but that's how you would work historically. One mortar cannot do everything, and if you have a mortar that can do everything, it's a mortar you shouldn't have in most of your building, because the reason it can do everything on the top of a chimney is that it's not breathable enough to keep your building dry. So yeah, that's the principle there. As far as the repair principles we're operating to, people might look at that and say, blimey, we've endeavoured to make sure that there are no loose stones, even where they might be projecting. But from the SPAB perspective and my own personal perspective, because I very much believe in the principles of the SPAB and William Morris in particular, we don't want to change this monument. We don't want to improve it by making it look neat and tidy. We want it to look like it did before. We don't want to impose our ideas onto it. We want to preserve the fabric as it is now. But clearly the cement with which it had been done, with the best of intention in the past by somebody, is not doing that monument any favour. It's very wet inside, and the cement itself, because it is a very hydraulic material, shrinks and expands whenever it gets wet, and therefore it comes loose and cracks and lets the water in. And because it's cement, it finds it very difficult to get out again. We're confident here that any water that gets into that fabric, because we've now got a very breathable mortar, that will come out again very quickly. It won't accumulate inside the fabric and then cause problems of frost damage potentially, but just buildings, structures don't want to be wet all the time. So yeah, and it's an earth lime built structure, Mud does not like to get wet. It's a very good structural material when it's relatively dry, but mud eventually, when it gets wet, even when it's got some lime in it, will turn to liquid and flow. Not catastrophically here, but obviously if the whole building was built of mud, which very many are in the world, they will just suddenly collapse and dip out if they get too wet. So an earth structure should never be rendered or covered with a cement or indeed a natural hydraulic lime mortar, because they're inside they'll get wetter and wetter and wetter, and then the day will come when they'll turn to mud and slide. So yeah. Okay, well we're going to just do a couple of lime wash mixes. There are lots of reasons to use lime wash, and in traditional building, lime wash really is the last coat. It's the last part of the system. There are very few buildings in this country, you would say, that weren't lime washed routinely. You know, we all love to see the stone and all of this. In my village in Thorndale, I would say every building was lime washed regularly, but not as regularly, not as people think every year. Even some lime suppliers say you'll have to do it every year or two. There's a reason for that, perhaps. When we started again, sorry, I have to go again to where we got things wrong or made mistakes or errors in the lime revival, and really we made lime wash from taking 3-month-old lime putty, typically, which historically they would say has already lost a lot of its binding power because it's been laid down for a period of time, a long period of time, 3 months or longer. And we would dilute that, and if we tried to put that on, if we diluted it such as it looked like a paint, had any thickness or viscosity to it, and we applied that, it would craze uncontrollably, really. And so over time in the lime revival we evolved a rule which never existed historically, but we evolved a rule, like so many of the rules we evolved in the lime revival. And please don't get me wrong, I am a creature of the lime revival. I'm in a direct line of descent from Wells Cathedral. I didn't know Professor Baker, but I was trained by people who trained with Professor Baker on Wells Cathedral, where the lime revival in the UK began. So I am very much a creature of the lime revival. But we invented rules, in truth, that made the best of the fact that we were using the wrong material, but we didn't know we were using the wrong material. So, because lime wash of any thickness made from lime putty would craze, we evolved the rule that you applied that in water-thin coats, in 5 to 7 water-thin coats typically. All of the cost in lime washing really is in the labour. I've just lime washed a whole 2-storey building in York. The lime to do that cost me £6. If I'd done that with apparently breathable but vapour permeable mineral paint or that kind of thing, it would have, for the paint, it would have cost me well over £1,000 to do that same job. So the cost in lime washing is in the labour. So if you're applying 7 coats, that's a lot of labour. In all of the building accounts, all of the texts I've read, I've never seen more than 3 coats of lime wash specified, and it's usually 2. And that's from fresh, that's new lime washing. When you're replenishing an existing lime wash, 1 coat will generally be quite sufficient. The difference here is, when we're talking 2 and 3 coats, we're talking hot lime wash, which of all the things we've been looking at and discussing this week, is the well within living memory. Is still the norm where people lime wash in Spain and all over the world, that the knowledge that that is mixed from quicklime and applied hot, applied whilst it's still hot. And that, because of the nature of hot lime, which is taken advantage of for grouting walls, pouring it, that it flows and moves when it's hot in ways that it simply can't when it's cold. So a grout poured in, which is essentially a lime wash, poured into the wall will find its way into every last hole in that wall and fill that up completely, making that a fully capillary active wall. I'm not going to say what we were talking about earlier. So treat this as a triple demonstration really. What I'm going to demonstrate now is making lime wash traditionally for hot use. If you were to put aggregates in it as you're making it, limestone dusts or even sands, that would be a shelter coat, commonly used in the conservation industry, and for good reason. Or it would be a hot lime ground. So this is a triple demonstration of 3 traditional materials, if you like, or a material for 3 different purposes. In the case of shelter coats, when we made those from lime wash, from lime putty, which we did, a bucket of shelter coat would arrive, and at the bottom of it there'd be a layer of concrete, because the aggregates were really well graded. They'd sink to the bottom before it arrived. You'd actually often have to get a chisel to break that up. You'd mix it into the lime material, the lime liquid, and if you were lucky, you'd get it to where you were going to apply it before all of that had sunk back down to the bottom again, if you were lucky. When you do it with a hot lime wash and then add the aggregates remain in suspension for way beyond the time that you need to actually apply it. So these are things that are telling us what we were doing probably wasn't what they did. Not that they often use shelter coats as such. So again, this is a function of hot lime, that it's the bonds that we're getting, as we've discussed, and as we get when we hot mix with sands and others, we're getting complex bonds between the ingredients, and that includes between the water and the aggregates. So that's why it'll hold up. And when we've done days like this, often I get challenged, well, will it hold up coarse sharp sand? And I can tell you, yes it will. That won't sink straight to the bottom. Beyond that, if you let it go cold, yeah, over a couple of weeks that aggregate will sink down to the bottom. But even though it's cold by then, stir it up and that will remain up in suspension again. So this property is coming from the process, as it is with hot mixing. So traditionally, as with making lime putty, all of these things, they would start with lump lime and they would add water to lump lime. I'm going to show you 2 methods for making hot lime wash. One that's less traditional and one that is the way they did it. So we'll start with a batch of lump lime. So we've got Portland stone lime, quick lime burned in a kiln, a small kiln. I'm going to have to use all this somehow today because I've ripped the lid into pieces trying to get it off. But so a certain amount of quick lime in there, and then again this historical iron rule, the opposite of other rules more recently. I'm going to
what do you need?
Start putting water to that, and again, as we were discussing earlier, just sufficient water, not loads of water. And whilst that's getting going, I'm just going to put some water into here. You can hear it's going. Nice reverberation from the metal bucket. Oh dear. Do that again. And they tend to say, in the case of making lime wash, I mean with mortars they'll say leave that alone, don't mess with it, but they do tend to say stir it a bit as the water's there. Sorry, yeah, I'm just getting rid of that. And then you can top the water up a little bit as you're going, but being careful not to drown it, so it just stops slaking for a while. And then, as I say, as that's going, I'm going to start the other method. And this is the method using powdered quicklime. And I'm going to break some of the rules I've just said to you. I'm going to put this in trowel by trowel until it arrives where I want it to be. So, and if I was using pigment, I would put that in now and mix that in that water before I add any lime. Not wait till it's having to try and mix it into the lime. Okay, so I put one trowel full of lime in there. Keep my eye on that one. Coming along nicely. Actually, you can't see that, but and you can see it generating a good deal of heat, so we know that's reaching 100 degrees. This one isn't, but yeah, look. Now there, with what, a trowel of quicklime from a bag that cost £10. How much is a trowel's worth of lime in that context? Is it even 50p? I don't know. That's what you might buy from the likes of Farrow & Ball. That there, with that much lime in it. That's a water-thin lime wash. And last I heard, they charge £70 for a paint pot sized tin of that. I put in about 10p worth of lime, I feel. And that's what's in that that's the only cost other than water and labour that's in that tin, yeah? I've heard they're very litigious, Farrow & Ball. Sorry about that, Jonathan. Who's got the copyright here? I defy them to tell me that's not true. Let's be generous. Let's say there's 2 trowelfuls of lime in there. Okay, so that's gone in. It's apparently slaked, but that's been drowned. I've just drowned that lime. Okay, so I'm now going to follow that up straight. I do be normally doing this a bit more in sequentially. I'm going to put another trowel full of lime in. Okay, so let's say that's what you get when you buy a water-thin lime wash. And yeah, when you paint that on, it looks like you're painting water on the wall. And then it goes white or whatever colour when it carbonates. This is coming on nicely here now. Look, we've got a nice sort of slurry-like mixture going on. I'm keeping stirring it because I want all of that, or as much as can, to slake, or as will. And I can add a bit more water. Now that's quite warm. That's getting warm. So I'm going to put another one in. God, I love this Portland quicklime. Just add a bit more. And another one. And the chemist in the room will tell us that for every 10-degree rise in the temperature of the liquid, the reaction will double in time, will speed up twice in time, and you're seeing that it's reacting as soon as I put it in. So although I drowned lime in the beginning, I feel, I might be wrong, I feel that now that the temperature is reaching the right temperature, that it's picking up that lime. And this is powder, of course, so the burnings, chilling, or vice versa, drowning, can be overcome, I believe, and that's what we're seeing now. And so we now got quite a viscous material. I'm still not quite happy with that. I mean, I'm not confident that has yet reached 100 degrees.
I can see it bubbling, is that right?
Yeah, no.
Yeah.
sometimes that bubbling is not boiling, it's the exothermic reaction. I mean, not always, don't get me wrong. What I'm looking for, to use the technical term, I'm looking for a whoosh. Yeah, I think I've got my whoosh, and it thickens very quickly. If you were grouting and you were clever, and that is 100 degrees, I can tell you that, it's just landed on my finger, and that's, I've got a little internal thermometer in my finger, so that's okay, that's pretty thick, yeah. That's certainly not a water thin coat of lime wash. It's also it's got good rheology. Sorry to use that word, I didn't know what it meant until recently. I always use the word flow. So it's got good flow, and that, although that's pretty thick, that would be, you could put that on the wall. Because it's hot, you thin that on the wall, and it flows, it spreads, it moves very readily because it's hot.
To wet your wall in first?
Sometimes, not always. I mean, you'll read contradictory things, and you'll probably know that Paris says you should apply lime wash to a dry surface in the Bible, the biblical text of the SPAB, Paris's book. I'm still evolving my thinking around that, but I mean, a little bit of water, and let it dry back, not glistening in the normal way. Yeah, some water doesn't hurt, and it depends on the time of year, it depends on lots of things, yeah? But I find lime wash attaches very well when you apply it to essentially a dry surface. And this is the area, sorry Jonathan, I'll get distracted. Right, okay, so, I mean, I could use that now. I could apply that somewhere. Oh, there's a nice gravestone. No, I'm going to apply it to a non-porous surface. Let's see. And I think you can see the principle that you know exactly what your colour is because you can bloody see it. Obviously it's going to get paler as it carbonates if you've got pigment in there. I'm going to wash my truck on one of these days. See if I can get back to Yorkshire without it coming off. But alternatively, now that the slake is finished, there it is, and this one too, you can see in here I've got, a paste. So I'm now, and I could have done it a bit sooner, but now I'll add more water into there, obviously. Again, adding the extra water when the slake is complete, and start to stir that around. And equally, although I could apply that now at that thickness when it's hot, I'm going to add a bit of water to that just to thin it back again. So I could have used it before that final thing, but I wasn't. But again, we want this minimum temperature. That's where the secret lies. That's where the magic comes, from the temperature. So I'm going to add a bit in, and again mix that in. Sorry. And we used to debate what was the right thickness, or what perhaps might be the minimum thickness of this. And we were doing a day in Wrexham, and we were, as we do on these days, said, well, yeah, this sort of thickness, that sort of thickness, and an old lady at the back put her hand up and said, well, that's exactly how we used to make it on the farm. That's this method, when we did the animal sheds and everything. And our rule was, the right thickness is when you dip a brush and you take it out, it doesn't drip. Anyone who's done lime washing with 7 water thin coat lime, you know that is the messiest bloody job in the world, yeah? And that's the job when you're most likely to get lime in your eye, in my experience. Lime washing, you hit a knobble of stone, poof, and then So, I mean, but I can thin that more from that perspective, but that again, that capacity to not drip is to do with the bond we've got within that material, between the water and the lime in this case, at the moment. I could thin that more,
Do you prefer the result from one method over the other? Traditional versus...
Sorry. What you would do, because almost inevitably you will have some lumps, or I can't feel many in this one, actually. Bloody lovely. I've only just started using this pot. I burned it a year ago, but and if you wanted to come and have a look, you can see lots of little tiny black specks in this one, not in that one. Those tiny black specks are the bit of grit that fell to the sea floor that rolled around and accumulated the lime around it to form an oolite. So in a sense, there's a tiny bit of aggregate in there, but so that one, I'm thinning that down. But what they would do with lump lime, if they wanted, it depends on the finish you're after. You can see that's going to give a silky finish. There's no aggregate in there whatsoever, and it's this pure lime. This one, if there's any lumps left, they'll be small, and when you apply the finish, you'll get a little bits of grit on the. Well, actually, I quite like that, depending on the status of the building. So, and the other thing to say, of course, most of any real lumps are going to sink to the bottom, but the other way of dealing with it, and this was the way that they dealt with lime putty as well, rather than laying it down in a pit for those lumps to be slaked away over time, would be now to dilute that down to what we've done, to a lime wash consistency. Doesn't drip, nicer colour actually, but you can see the little tiny bits of unslaked lime. So you would do that and then pour it straight through a sieve to extract those lumps and then apply it. So that's the method there, and that one is a perfectly acceptable thickness. If I can show you, so you can see it's not as thick as that, which kind of reflects the method. I can make this one as thin as that, and again, as I mix more water in, it will be taken in and bonded in. But that one's perfectly acceptable. You can see it doesn't drip. Got the little bits of grit, but that's, as I say, those I wouldn't mind in an animal shed, or in. This is what we did in that spout house I showed you last night, and we just applied it. So you've got these little bits of grit. I mean, you can actually brush them off after it's set, in a way, if you want to. But I quite like that, and as Henry Scott and as all these other guys said, we are inherently lazy as craftsmen, so I'll avoid that if I can. Sorry, I'm excited. That's such a nice. I can feel how nice that is. But anyway, that's essentially it. And if we were grouting, as I say, the clever thing to do would be to do this on the scaffold next to the wall you're going to grout. Get that, and you'll know, according to all the variables, the one that's going to make it whoosh. Get that one in and pour it into the wall, so that whoosh happens in the wall, and because you're getting that stiffening in the wall there. But as I say, so long as it's hot, that's you get a lovely thick finish. Historically, they used to lime wash gravestones.
It's true, they did, and that's protected them.
And they lime wash floors in animal sheds. Remember, lime wash is antiseptic. So that's the reason for annual lime washing. It's not because it needs to be done every year. Don't think where it's done every year, like in Spain, that's spring cleaning, really, in their heads, and it's antibacterial. If you go in a house in Spain where they lime wash the timbers, they very rarely have any rot or animal attack, beetle attack or anything. Those timbers that haven't got the lime wash on are usually rotten and eaten away. So there's every good reason to do it quite regularly, but that's for function, not for necessity. Oh, thank you very much. So that's the first coat, and I tend to just keep building coats or building levels because it starts to stiffen, and that's the other benefit of putting it onto a drier surface. It starts to stiffen, and then it's in the half jelly-like state where you could burnish it if you wanted to, but apply another coat and you kind of burnish it and apply another coat at the same time, if that makes sense to you. That's my feeling about it. So essentially that's a hot line wash. And
how long in between coats?
Well, I do it day on day normally.
Yeah.
And I don't cover it, I don't protect it, unless it's scorching hot and it's in the full sun. I wouldn't even damp it at all in the meantime. Yes, and I just say, as I just said, the final coat, or if you were really assiduous, the first, every coat, all three or all two, you could, as it's half set, you go onto it with a dry brush and polish it, and that will create a really tight surface. And I've seen people with a hot line wash like this. Nick Durnan showed examples where he did it on his one of his buildings. You can see your bloody face in it. It's like a mirror. So you can really tighten it up, especially if you use powder lime. And Bill Reevy would say that is the best way of stopping rain getting in, is really tightening that surface. Most rainwater is just going to bounce off it effectively. And tomorrow, those of you, we'll leave this, tomorrow you'll see, well, it's not far off now what is sold to us as lime putty, actually. But by tomorrow, that will certainly, it will have stiffened and become lime putty as we're given it these days. And yeah, so you wouldn't then use it as a lime wash anymore, unless, you know, you keep some if you have to top up here and there. I've not tried it, you know, letting it go cold and using it as a whole thing. But actually, I believe it probably would be fine, because the qualities of it have been given to it by that slaking and that right temperature of the slaking. Yeah. This one still remains, yeah, I say fairly runny, but good enough. You know, it doesn't drip. And got another stone. Well, we'll top up this one with the Portland.
Nigel, get a bit of a feel for how much coverage that is. How much of that gable end would that do?
That would do at least half of one of those gable sides, okay. Yeah, at least, yeah. In one coat. Okay. Maybe might even stretch it to two, because you're thinning it out on the wall. The first coat's going to be thinner, yeah. But you'll see the next coat, when that's dried up a bit or stiffened somewhat, the next coat will give you complete coverage. It'll grab on, because it grabs onto the line that's already there. They're intimately compatible, obviously they're the same bloody thing, but in a slightly different stage of setting. So inside and out, and it would be more likely burnished inside than out. There are things to think about here that I see in the building accounts, for instance. One in Swindon in the 19th century, and plastering masonry work was always paid by measured rate, well, not by competitive tender. Competitive tender goes with the architects coming in and at the end of the 19th century. And it's part of when everything started going wrong, because competitive tender is not any way to get a good job. Certainly not if you go for the cheapest tender, which everybody does, of course. Measured rates were a much better way. And measured rates, you think that through, you didn't have differential rates of pay necessarily between the team, but their different skill levels would enable them to earn more money if they wanted to by doing more work in a day. Measured rate. And the benefit of that, if you do more work when you're working to measured rates, is that you, the craftsperson, gets the benefit, the money. If you're doing it working for somebody who's got it on competitive tender and they're pushing you to do more work, and you do more work, who gets the benefit? Because you're getting paid exactly the same. This is not an insignificant factor in all of this, yeah? This is a social thing, and these things are going on. So anyway, that's a hot line wash, simple as that. Get it on as hot as you can, and so on, and forget about water thin lime washes made out of lime putty, unless you just want to spend money. And it doesn't give you as good a finish either. But sorry, what I was going to say is, yeah, measured rates. It was for about 200 years in most parts of the country, the measured rate for applying 3 coats of plaster was 3d a yard. And in Swindon in 1860 it still was, but then they were lime washing the buildings after that, and they're getting 3d a yard for lime washing, and I'm thinking, what on earth is going on here? How can that take longer? But the only explanation is the burnishing and the really working of that surface to bring it to an immaculate weatherproof finish. The last thing I want to say is don't let any line supplier tell you that, or they can tell you, but tell them to get lost. Don't let them tell you to put linseed oil in here. or tallow or any of these things unless you want that lime wash to be waterproof. And if it's waterproof, it'll come off much sooner than if it isn't. And that research, I mean, there's plenty of research, but the National Park Service in America did research into the lime washes some 10 years ago or more. They tried all the different things with all the different so-called traditional additives, tallow, all these things, and they proved in the lab and on site that the most durable lime wash was the lime wash that had no additives at all. That's the most durable material. The others are not durable. If you put linseed into your last coat of lime wash, because you can actually only put it in your last coat of lime wash, because as soon as you've got linseed in that lime wash, you are never going to be able to retreat that lime wash with another coat of lime wash. It won't stick to it. It'll just come off it. So and tallow the same. The US Park Service, they thought that these additions were to improve the stickiness of it somehow, but it certainly wasn't to improve the performance. The last piece of really relevant research in Portugal, the Technical University in Portugal, who've done a lot of really good research into vernacular materials and practice, more than any other university department really. They tested lime wash on the least porous to the most porous substrate. Their hypothesis was that coats of lime wash inhibited the drying of the building. So they were clearly gobsmacked to discover that no matter how porous or how little porous the substrate, that the fabric of that structure dried more efficiently, faster, and to greater depth with a coat of lime wash than without a coat of lime wash. That sounds insane, like the word I kept using last night ridiculously, but that sounds counterintuitive. But we take it back to capillarity, we take it back to dynamic capillary activity. That's why, because that, and I'd say the same about hot mix pointing. This is not a passive system. These materials are not a passive system, they're a dynamic system. They are actively moving water out. So a building that I've worked on recently, a church wall that had lost its pointing, still had its earth lime mortars but set back, that wall was wet. We pointed with a hot mix, within a week it was a dry wall. Because actually having the pointing there on the face where the air can wick away the water molecules by capillary movement is what you need. It's not, you think, oh well, why wouldn't it dry when the mortars are back there? But because the air movement can't reach them in the same way. You need that surface finish to be actively sucking water out of your fabric. And these lime washes, Luke will confirm this wherever he is, if he's here. No. Oh, there he is. You got your sunglasses on instead of last night when you were waiting, and this sticks as well onto a non-permeable background, doesn't it? You know, and it'll stick even better to a like this non-permeable stone here. So
would aggregates be in there from the beginning if you were doing it with aggregates?
As shelter coat, no, I'd put them in about halfway through. Yeah, and keep mixing and like I just did. Sorry?
Would you put aggregates in the grout?
Not necessarily, they didn't typically. It's hot lime grout is what they're talking about. It sounds madness because you think, is that going to carbonate? Yeah. But of course it's got the suction from the core start if they're porous, and its own tendency to stiffen, and that's why I say about a bit like gilding, there's a window of opportunity to really maximise that, which is to do it straight off the scaffold there and then, and at that moment when it whooshes, if you can get it in then. It can be quite tricky, but I was doing it recently. So I hope that's a good explanation, and of course bear in mind the cost. I mean, and you're getting for a low cost, a hugely efficient material that will last a long time. I mean, I've got lime wash coats in Molten that we put on nearly 20 years ago that haven't needed doing again. Don't get the idea. And even with the water thin stuff, my house that you saw last night, somebody that I've just put another coat of hot lime wash, that was done with the water thin coat, and that had lasted 15 years. It was only in a few places that was. So lime wash is much more durable than people say. And if you think about a 15 or a 20-year cycle, that's actually a longer cycle than most modern paints would achieve on that same building. And it will be doing your building good in the meantime, not bad, which most of the other modern things would be.
Is that a reasonable period of time before recoating or sooner?
Yeah, and even on my house, it was only just underneath the windowsills where you're getting cascading water hitting the wall that it was beginning to degrade a little bit, or here and there. But of course, again, it's showing you up any problems you've got. Because lime wash, you know, when it's got pigment in, goes on a much darker shade and then carbonates back to a paler shade. But every time it gets wet, it will go back to that original darker shade. And so it'll tell you where you've got damp issues. In towns like this, in Scotland, in Wales, you know, where do people still lime wash, or did they lime wash the longest? In the wettest parts of the country. And yet we're told that pure lime is not durable in these parts of the country. And yet most of the buildings are lime washed with pure lime, and it doesn't fall off, generally speaking. It doesn't suffer in frost. It's so capillary active that as soon as it gets wet, almost it gets rid of that water very. In parallel with the works to the gable, we've had teams also working on this wall, the cartilage wall of the churchyard, obviously, so important in itself. And we were applying the same principles, but here and there, we needed to take down and rebuild. So again, we rebuilt with the ordinary, somewhat feebly hydraulic mortar for the most part, and we've repointed with that same mortar, so the more breathable mortar. In the lower and ordinary sections, but the copings, of course, again, they have this issue of receiving a lot of rain. In the copings, so the copings have been bedded, and the bed joint of the copings and the top joints of the copings have been done with another pozzolanic hydraulic mortar, so again hot mix, so we retain the workability and all of those things which are of benefit to us in applying the material. This is a different one. This is a volcanic ash, very much used historically in this country, Trass, volcanic ash from Germany. This one has a slightly faster initial set than the ones we're using over there, but it still retains that water retentivity and workability. And that is because clearly we need to resist the rain that's hitting the top of the wall. But the breathability we need as much as possible in the other parts of the wall. The general facing of the wall, because the breathability of a solid wall is essential to its health, and I would say to the health of the people that live inside that building, not to have a damp wall. And if this was a house wall, and in this town, and in most towns in the UK over the centuries, these buildings would at least be lime washed. They might be rendered, harled, as it would in Scotland, a very thin harl, but that's applying a fully breathable coat over the whole of that building that is going to receive a little moisture but get rid of any moisture either from within or received as quickly as possible. And if you really want to make that the maximum system, which they always did, onto that harling, or indeed onto the naked stone, at least if you didn't harl, would be lime wash, because lime wash is a fully capillary active pure lime material. And I just emphasise, never be tempted to listen to people who tell you to put linseed oil or tallow in those lime washes. They work the best, and they move moisture out very efficiently, and more efficiently, in fact, than if they weren't there at all. That's maybe a counterintuitive thing, but they will dry the fabric more efficiently and to greater depth for being there than for not being there. And that's an important point to make. This is a dynamic system of moisture removal. So lastly, just focusing in on some of the finer detail here, this mortar has just gone in. This is the pozzolanic mortar, so it's moving to stiffness pretty quickly. This is off the tool and polished, and that's not how we would leave it normally. You can see here some has already been taken back that was done yesterday or the day before. And this area, which is the more normal mortar, this process has already happened. So typically we would do that with a little piece of stick, a bit of plastering lath, take off that lime-rich surface and then beat it with a brush just to roughen it up but a little. And what we're doing there is increasing the surface area quite significantly, but also it's a nicer texture to look at aesthetically. This has been done over the hair. The one point I would like to make at the last here is that people are tempted to feel that you need to use natural hydraulic lime because it sets fast or it sets quickly and they have the idea that lime does not move towards initial set quickly. But that we're in a position here where after 5 days, this work, we can, generally speaking, walk away from it. Someone will come in tomorrow to just check the stuff that was done today, and this mortar is very well set, but not fully set, but that's all it needs to be, is very well initially set. And I would say that the time sequence with pure limes or with feebly hydraulic limes, if you deal with them as you should and don't keep wetting them once you put them in, hydraulic limes and cements need to be wetted for a long period, far longer than people think, after they've been put in. But essentially airline mortars do not, and therefore they move towards an initial set far faster than people think. And the time schedules on site are in no way less, or it takes no way more time to use the proper lime than it does to use it expediently or mistakenly to use one that you think is going to make your job quicker. It won't, because particularly because they need hydration for a long period. So you're going to be having, if you're doing it properly with hydraulic materials, you need to be on site or to come back to site and wet those mortars every day for actually far longer than people think, but for at least 2 weeks or more, at least. So bear this in mind. The air limes are not a material that's going to slow you down or stop you achieving what you need to achieve in a sensible time. In fact, I would argue you can achieve that sooner because they don't need all that ongoing hydration. So you're saving an awful lot of faff and time for using those mortars at the same time as giving your buildings what they want and what they need and what we need when we live in them.